Henry watched Eliza across the dinner table, fork poised midair, as her words hung between them. So, maybe it's time we spice things up a bit, she said, her voice light but firm. What if we tried and open our relationship? Just for a weekend. He felt something inside him tighten. He put his fork down, his appetite gone. Eliza kept her gaze steady, waiting. He could see the excitement in her eyes, like she had just presented him with the idea of a weekend getaway, something thrilling and new. An open relationship? Just for a weekend? He echoed, forcing a neutral tone. He wasn't sure what to make of this. After 10 years together, 2 kids, and countless late-night conversations about how they were each other's only one, the suggestion hit him like cold water. Eliza nodded, her eyes darting between his. Yeah, it's just an experiment. A chance to see things from another perspective, I guess. We've been together a long time. Henry, don't you ever wonder what it would be like to just try something different? Henry took a sip of water, stalling for time. Is there something you're missing, Eliza? Something I haven't given you? It's not that, she said quickly. It's not about you at all. It's just, I don't know, Henry. Sometimes I feel like I've missed out on things, experiences. Maybe this could be good for us. Henry leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. And what exactly do you think we'd gain from this? Perspective. Freedom. Maybe we'd even appreciate each other more, she said, her tone almost pleading now. It's just for one weekend, no strings, no attachments. Then we go back to normal. Just try it. For us? The "for us" felt like an afterthought, a hook to pull him in. He glanced away, thinking. He hadn't felt anything lacking in their relationship, but he couldn't ignore her eagerness. He had always known she had a bit of a restless streak, but this, he had to admit, it left him uneasy. All right, he said slowly. If this is what you really want, we can try it. But there are going to be rules. We need to be clear on what we're doing, Eliza. She smiled, visibly relaxing. Of course. Whatever you need to feel comfortable. This is just for fun for one weekend. Nothing more. Then here's how it'll work, he said, voice firm. No secrets. We talk about everything afterward. No attachments, no staying overnight anywhere. Just a single weekend. Agreed, she said, relief washing over her face. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The excitement in her eyes hadn't faded. In fact, it seemed to intensify. He wondered if she had already been thinking about this for some time. Maybe she'd even been planning it. Later that night, Henry sat alone in his study, the faint hum of Eliza putting dishes away in the kitchen in the background. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring into the amber liquid, letting the quiet settle around him. She hadn't seemed unhappy, not that he could tell. But the way she'd brought up this experiment, it was as if she'd been waiting for the right moment, choosing her words carefully. He thought back to their early years together, back when they had both been so inseparable. Their dreams had been simple, built around their growing careers, a house of their own, and then, eventually, a family. They had achieved all of that and more. But maybe he had missed something along the way, a small sign, a hint that she wanted more. The study door creaked, and Eliza appeared in the doorway, her expression soft. You're not mad, are you? She asked, stepping in. He forced a smile. No, just surprised. I didn't think you felt this way. I thought we were happy. We are happy, Henry, she said, crossing the room and leaning against his desk. It's not that I don't love our life. But don't you ever feel curious? Don't you ever wonder if there's more? Henry looked at her closely, searching for any sign of doubt, any hesitance in her eyes. So, have you been thinking about this for a while? She bit her lip, glancing down. Maybe. Sometimes I feel like I settled down so fast, like there were other things I never got to experience. You were my first serious relationship, Henry. My only one. That's what I thought we both wanted, he said, keeping his tone even. A stable life. Something we could build together. And I do want that. I'm just wondering if it would hurt to try something different. It's just one weekend, Henry. He nodded, watching her closely. So, you already have someone in mind? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Her face flushed, but she quickly masked it. No, of course not. It's just a hypothetical, right? Henry looked down at his whiskey, then back at her. All right, Eliza, but let's be clear about this. No hidden motives, no second chances on this. If we do this, it's because we're both fully on board, and we're going to be honest about it. Agreed, she said, her voice steady, though he detected a hint of relief. Then I'll take your word for it, he said, finishing his drink. They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with something unspoken. Finally, she turned and left the room, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts. Over the next few days, Henry found himself watching Eliza more closely. Little things started to stand out. The way she'd linger by her phone, the way she'd smile at a text and tuck her phone away quickly when he walked into the room. Doubts started creeping in, small at first, then gathering like a storm. Had she already been seeing someone? Was this weekend experiment just a way to excuse something she'd already done? He caught himself following her gaze more often, noticing how her eyes would light up when she talked about work, particularly about a recent project she'd been doing with a certain colleague. He'd never felt the need to question her loyalty, but now every word, every movement felt loaded, like clues to a puzzle he hadn't realized he was trying to solve. On Friday night, as they got ready for bed, he finally voiced what had been weighing on his mind. "Eliza, if you've already been seeing someone, you'd tell me, right?" She froze, her hand hovering midair as she reached to turn off the bedside lamp. "Henry, what are you talking about? You seem different, like you're hiding something. This whole idea of an open weekend, has this been in the works for a while?" Eliza turned, her face hardening. "I'm not hiding anything, Henry. I asked you for this because I thought we could both use it. You think I'd go behind your back? After everything we've been through?" He studied her face. She sounded hurt, defensive, and maybe even a bit angry. Maybe he was reading too much into things. Maybe he was letting his insecurities cloud his judgment. He forced himself to relax, giving her a small nod. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. This is all new to me. I don't want to lose what we have." She softened, reaching out to take his hand. "You're not going to lose me, Henry. This is just something I need to do. And it doesn't mean I love you any less." He nodded, though the uneasy feeling in his chest remained. They lay down together, the bed feeling colder than usual, as if a chasm had opened between them that neither knew how to cross. That night, long after Eliza had fallen asleep, Henry lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He had agreed to her experiment, but something told him that once they crossed this line, things would never be the same. Eliza checked her reflection one last time in the hotel mirror, smoothing her dress, brushing a finger over her lips to perfect her lipstick. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't supposed to feel nervous, but she did. It wasn't guilt, she told herself. It was just the thrill of stepping into something new, something she had never dared before. Her phone buzzed. It was him, her husband's best friend, Charles. He was already in the lobby. She glanced at herself again, feeling a mix of anticipation and something else she couldn't quite name. She reminded herself of the terms. One weekend, no strings, just a bit of fun. Henry had agreed, hadn't he? They'd even shaken hands on it. This was something they'd both decided to do for the good of their marriage, she reassured herself. Grabbing her purse, Eliza left the hotel room and took the elevator down, her heart racing. Charles was waiting, standing by the fountain in the lobby, dressed impeccably as always. His smile was charming and confident, his eyes scanning her as she approached. "Eliza," he said warmly, taking her hand. "You look stunning." She smiled, feeling a blush creep up her neck. "Thank you. You didn't have to wait down here." "Oh, but I wanted to. It's not every day I get to spend a weekend with such a beautiful woman." He led her out of the lobby and into a private car waiting at the entrance. They drove to an exclusive restaurant, where he had arranged a candlelit table, complete with champagne and a view of the city skyline. The service was attentive, every detail finely orchestrated. Eliza let herself sink into the experience, enjoying the way Charles looked at her, the way he leaned in close when he spoke, as if she were the only person in the world. For the first time in years, she felt genuinely seen, desired. Yet, somewhere deep down, there was a twinge of something uncomfortable, a flicker of guilt. She brushed it aside, convincing herself that Henry had given his blessing, that this was just a new experience. She told herself it was about finding freedom, adding a spark to her life, her marriage. This weekend was just a chapter in their story, not the end of it. The evening passed in a whirl of conversation and laughter. When they finally returned to the hotel, Charles took her hand, leading her to his room with a quiet confidence. She followed, feeling her pulse quicken. She reminded herself again. Henry knew, he'd agreed, and this was just an experiment, something that would end on Sunday night. Meanwhile, Henry was sitting in his car, parked a block away, his phone in hand. He hadn't planned on following her, but something had gnawed at him ever since he had agreed to this experiment. He had tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that she would come back and everything would be the same. But when he watched her leave the house that morning, dressed in a way she hadn't dressed for him in months, he couldn't shake the feeling. Now, watching her walk arm in arm with his best friend, he felt a cold wave wash over him. He was surprised at how calm he felt, how numb. The anger was there, simmering under the surface, but mostly he felt empty, like he was watching someone else's life unravel before him. He snapped a few photos, his jaw clenched, his mind already calculating his next steps. In his mind, he replayed her words from the night they had discussed this whole open weekend. She had assured him it was just an experiment, that it was something they both needed. But watching her now, it didn't feel like she was doing this for them. She looked like she was living out a fantasy, one that had nothing to do with him. The betrayal stung, cutting deeper with every passing minute. Henry watched as they disappeared into the hotel, his eyes hardening. He sat there for a few more minutes, collecting himself. The truth of her intentions was as clear as day, and it felt as though every shared moment, every promise they'd made, had been reduced to this. His heart felt like a clenched fist, anger and hurt swirling together. Upstairs, in the opulent suite Charles had reserved, Eliza marveled at the view of the city lights, the way they sparkled against the night sky. She took in her surroundings, noticing the details Charles had carefully arranged: champagne chilling in a silver bucket, roses on the table, a playlist of soft jazz playing in the background. She turned to him, smiling. "You really went all out. Only the best for you, Eliza." He poured her a glass of champagne, handing it to her with a grin. "To a memorable weekend." She raised her glass, clinking it with his, trying to ignore the flutter of unease in her stomach. As the night unfolded, they talked about everything, their pasts, their dreams, even the little frustrations they both held on to. And for a moment, she felt liberated, unburdened by the weight of her regular life. In the early hours of the morning, as she lay next to him, staring at the ceiling, she felt a wave of guilt. She remembered Henry, the way he'd looked at her that night when they'd agreed to this. She wanted to believe he was all right with it, that he had trusted her, that he understood. But the image of his face lingered, making her chest tighten. "It's just one weekend," she whispered to herself, as if to silence her conscience. Back in his car, Henry sat in the darkness, unable to bring himself to leave. He felt like a stranger in his own life, watching as everything he'd built crumbled. He scrolled through the photos he'd taken, evidence of her betrayal, each one a reminder of the man he thought he knew, his best friend, who had been by his side through thick and thin. The depth of their betrayal was almost laughable. A part of him wanted to storm into that hotel, to confront them both, to demand an explanation. But he knew it wouldn't bring him peace. No, this would require something more. He would handle it quietly, carefully, giving them enough space to trap themselves fully. Sitting there, he felt his anger crystallize into a plan. He would wait until she returned, give her a chance to come clean. And if she didn't well, he would be ready. The weekend passed slowly, each day filled with lavish meals, outings, and stolen moments. Eliza let herself be swept up in the experience, telling herself it was all harmless. She and Charles laughed over drinks, shared stories late into the night, each moment designed to make her forget the world outside. Every so often, that pang of guilt would return, but she dismissed it, telling herself that everything would return to normal soon. On Sunday evening, as she packed her bag and prepared to head home, Charles kissed her, smiling. "Maybe we'll do this again sometime?" She smiled, of cause handsome, but as she left the hotel, walking through the lobby, the weight of what she had done settled heavily on her. She wasn't sure what she would tell Henry, or if he'd even want to know every detail. The closer she got to home, the more her confidence faded, replaced by a nervousness she couldn't shake. Eliza stepped out of the cab, clutching her overnight bag, and froze. She couldn't believe her eyes. Just a block from their house, a massive billboard loomed over the street, illuminated against the evening sky. Her heart dropped as she saw her own face plastered across it, photos of her laughing, smiling, holding hands with Charles outside the hotel. Above the images, in glaring red letters, were the words, "Unfaithful Wife 403." Eliza felt her pulse quicken, her chest tightening. This couldn't be real. She stumbled, almost dropping her bag. Her head spun as she tried to process it. Henry knew. He knew everything. She forced herself to take a breath, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. She could feel eyes on her, real or imagined, and each step toward the house felt heavier than the last. She wanted to look away, to erase what she'd just seen, but the images burned into her mind. The photos, all of them captured in vivid detail, left no room for denial, no chance to pretend that her betrayal was hidden. With trembling hands, Eliza reached the front door and fumbled with her keys, her mind racing. She half expected Henry to be waiting for her on the other side, but when she pushed the door open, the house was quiet. Too quiet. In the dim light of the hallway, she noticed an envelope resting on the kitchen counter. Her name was scrawled on the outside in Henry's neat handwriting. She felt a wave of dread wash over her as she approached it. She knew, even before she opened it, that whatever was inside would seal her fate. With shaky hands, she unfolded the letter. 3 words were written in bold, unforgiving ink. Signed the papers. Underneath, he had left a brief note. "You have 2 hours to pack your things and leave my house." The cold, final word struck her like a punch. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She stumbled back, gripping the edge of the counter as tears stung her eyes. It was over. Henry had left no room for excuses, no opening for forgiveness. He'd laid down his judgment, and it was brutal. The divorce papers lay beside the note, neatly arranged and awaiting her signature. Eliza's hand flew to her mouth as she let out a strangled sob. The weight of what she had done, the destruction of their life together, crashed over her. "No, no, this can't be happening," she whispered, her voice thick with desperation. A sudden noise from behind startled her, and she whirled around. Henry stood in the doorway, his expression cold and distant, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched her, his gaze unflinching, as if he were looking at a stranger. "Henry," she gasped, taking a step toward him. "Please let me explain." He shook his head, his face hard as stone. "Explain? I think I've seen all I need to see." "Henry, please," she choked, her voice trembling. It was a mistake. I never meant to hurt you." "A mistake?" he echoed, his tone dripping with bitterness. "You planned it, Eliza. You asked me for this one weekend idea. And all this time, you knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you?" She flinched, guilt flooding her. "I was wrong, I know. But I thought we both agreed." "No, you convinced me," he interrupted, his voice rising. "You painted this fantasy of freedom and perspective. And I, like a fool, thought maybe you were right. But this," he gestured toward the stack of papers, the billboard outside. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined." "Henry, I'm sorry," she sobbed, reaching out to him. "Please give me a chance to make this right. I didn't know it would hurt you this much." He stepped back, avoiding her touch. "You didn't know?" he scoffed. "Eliza, I trusted you. I believed you when you said it was for US." He clenched his fists, fighting to keep his composure. "But you were only thinking about yourself. And my best friend, no less. Do you know how humiliating that is?" Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, pleading. "I'll do anything, Henry. Please don't end things like this. We can get through this, can't we?" Henry's eyes narrowed, his voice a deadly calm. "Why should I give you a second chance, Eliza? Tell me, what makes you think you deserve it?" She sobbed, unable to answer. The words she wanted to say, the apologies, the promises felt hollow, meaningless. She had crossed the line, and now she saw the full weight of her betrayal. "Please, Henry," she whispered, broken. I know I hurt you, but I love you. I love our family. I'll do anything to make it right. Please, just give me a chance. He let out a bitter laugh, the sound filled with resentment. You love me? You love me. Yet you chose to spend the weekend in a hotel with another man? You call that love? It was a mistake, she repeated, her voice weak. I got carried away. I thought it was just a bit of excitement, but I see now it was wrong. Please, just let's talk about this. Henry stared at her, his face unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might relent, might soften. But then he shook his head, his voice colder than she'd ever heard. No, Eliza, this isn't something you can talk your way out of. You made your choice, and I'm making mine. He pointed to the divorce papers. Sign them. Leave. I don't want to see you here when I wake up in the morning. I mean, please, she begged, crawling toward him, her hands clasped together. Think of everything we've built. Think of our family. Don't throw it all away because of one mistake. You threw it away, Eliza, he said sharply. You did this, not me. I gave you everything, and you threw it back in my face. She looked up at him, her face wet with tears, her body trembling. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, pain, hurt, maybe even regret. But he quickly masked it, his expression hardening once again. Your apologies mean nothing to me now, he said, his voice steady. You had a choice, Eliza, and you made it. Now it's time for you to live with it. The finality in his tone crushed her, leaving her no room for hope. She looked down at the papers, her hands shaking as she reached for the pen. She hesitated, glancing up at him one last time, silently pleading for mercy. But Henry's gaze remained unwavering, his face set. Sign them, he repeated, his voice cold. Defeated, Eliza scrawled her name across the pages, each stroke feeling like the end of everything she had taken for granted. She felt numb, empty, as she signed away the life they had built together. When she finished, she looked up, but Henry had already turned away, heading toward the door. He paused in the doorway, his voice distant. 2 hours, Eliza. After that, I don't want to see you here. And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone in the silence. Eliza sat there, staring at the papers, the reality of her actions finally crashing down on her. She had lost him. Eliza's life had become a nightmare. She felt at the moment she stepped out of the small apartment she'd rented after Henry had thrown her out. The pitying glances, the sideways stares, and the not-so-quiet whispers followed her everywhere. On her first trip to the grocery store, she saw it. The look of disdain from the cashier, a young woman who'd always greeted her warmly. This time, the girl didn't meet her eyes, instead passing her change without a word. Eliza tried to brush it off as a coincidence, but it happened again at the coffee shop the next morning. The barista, who usually made polite small talk, simply handed over her order with a tight-lipped expression. By the end of the week, it was clear her reputation had spread far beyond the Billboard's reach. The judgment and cold shoulders weren't just from strangers. Her friends, even the few close ones she had confided in over the years, began distancing themselves. Eliza's messages went unanswered, her calls ignored. Invites to events and gatherings, once abundant, disappeared entirely. One evening, desperate for a familiar face, she tried calling her best friend, Esther. After 3 rings, the call finally connected. Hello. Esther's voice was curt. Esther, it's Eliza. I know you've heard about everything. I just need someone to talk to, Eliza said, her voice thick with emotion. There was a pause, then a sigh. Eliza, I don't know what you want me to say. You did this to yourself. I can't pretend to understand why you did it. And honestly, I don't want to be dragged into the middle of it. Eliza's heart sank. I know I messed up, Esther. But please, I just need a friend. You had a husband who trusted you, who gave you everything. And you threw it all away, Esther said quietly. Look, I have to go. The call disconnected, and Eliza stared at her phone, numb. Her own closest friend, someone she'd leaned on countless times, now saw her as nothing more than a scandal. The reality of her isolation set in as she lowered her phone, feeling a fresh wave of regret. Meanwhile, Charles faced his own downfall. The wealthy, carefree image he'd spent years cultivating was rapidly crumbling. Henry's revenge had been ruthless. Henry had connections in the business world, and with one phone call, Charles's company cut ties with him. Whispers of his betrayal circulated in his family, and before long, his parents called him in for a stern, uncomfortable conversation. "How could you betray Henry like this?" his father had demanded. "You had everything, Charles. And for what? A cheap affair?" Charles began, but his father silenced him with a look of sheer disappointment. "Spare me the excuses. We raised you better than this. I don't want to see you until you've put your life back in order." The words stung deeply. Charles felt himself disowned, cut off not only from his friends, but from his family too. He tried reaching out to Eliza, hoping for some semblance of support, but she'd stopped taking his calls after the fallout, consumed by her own struggles. Alone and ostracized, he was left to reckon with the shambles of his life. As the days passed, Eliza found herself reaching out to Henry in desperation. She left voicemail after voicemail, each message growing more frantic. "Henry, please, just hear me out," she pleaded one night, clutching her phone in a dim room. "I know I made the worst mistake of my life, but can we at least talk? Just one conversation? I miss you. I miss us. Please, Henry." Every call went unanswered, every message unreturned. She knew he was receiving them, but he stayed silent, his cold indifference more painful than any words of anger could have been. One day, she sent him a text, hoping maybe he'd reply in writing, if not in person. "Eliza, I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. Please just let me talk to you." Hours passed, and just when she thought he'd ignore her once again, a response appeared. "Henry, there's nothing to fix, Eliza. You made your choice." The finality of his words hit her like a physical blow. She tried to respond, but he'd blocked her number, leaving her words trapped on the screen. She sank onto her couch, feeling the walls of her new life close in on her. There was no way out. Henry had moved on, and the door to reconciliation was firmly shut. Bills began to pile up as Eliza's financial situation worsened. The settlement she'd received in the divorce was meager, and without Henry's support, she was forced to face a harsh reality. She took on part-time jobs to make ends meet, her life a stark contrast to the comfortable, stable home she'd once shared with him. The gossip followed her wherever she went, and her colleagues looked at her with thinly veiled contempt. She could see it in their eyes. They knew, or at least thought they knew, everything about her. Each day became a series of apologies she could never voice, a cycle of shame she couldn't escape. She found herself thinking of the nights spent in laughter with Henry, their shared dreams, the plans they'd made together. The weight of her regret was unbearable. Her past life felt like a distant memory, and the person she'd been felt like a stranger. Eliza lay awake most nights, replaying every decision that had led her to this point. The painful reality of her choices, and the consequences she now faced, hung over her like a dark cloud. She wondered if she'd ever be able to find redemption, if anyone would ever look at her without judgment again. Her thoughts inevitably returned to Henry, to the man she'd hurt beyond repair. She ached to reach out, to somehow undo the damage. But every attempt she made only served to deepen the chasm between them. And as the weeks turned to months, Eliza realized with a sinking certainty that her former life, and the man she'd once called her husband, were lost to her forever. The hardest part was seeing Henry appear in their community with a calm, unbothered demeanor. He seemed untouched by the chaos she was enduring. He laughed easily, greeted people warmly, and carried on as if nothing had happened. She heard whispers that he was thriving, that he had even started seeing someone new. The thought twisted like a knife in her chest, but she had no right to feel hurt. She had driven him away. One afternoon, she saw him in passing, walking through the park. She hesitated, her heart pounding, wanting to approach him, to beg one last time for a chance to explain. But the moment she took a step forward, he caught her eye and looked away, his face impassive. He kept walking without a word, leaving her standing alone, as if she were a stranger. The shame of that moment lingered, reminding her that her actions had brought her to this place. She was living the life she had created, and there was no one to blame but herself. Every friendship she'd valued, every connection she'd taken for granted, had been severed by her own hand. Months later, Eliza was still struggling. She'd taken to working late shifts at a local diner, the only job she could find, and spent her days in solitude. The social exclusion and whispers had faded, replaced by a quieter, more profound loneliness. In the end, there were no more calls to make, no more apologies to offer. Her life, once vibrant and full, had withered into a hollow shell, a constant reminder of her betrayal. Eliza knew she would carry this regret with her for the rest of her days. The consequences of her actions had rippled through her life, and as she walked through each day, facing the cold realities of her choices, she accepted the truth. Forgiveness was a luxury she would never be granted. Henry adjusted his tie, taking a last look at himself in the mirror. It had been a year since his life had changed completely. He hardly recognized the man looking back at him. He seemed stronger, somehow steadier. For the first few months, he kept to himself, struggling in silence to process the betrayal that had torn his life apart. But slowly, he had found ways to rebuild. He dove into his work, took on new challenges, even picked up a few hobbies he had put aside years ago. Yet, what surprised him most was how he began to enjoy his life again. One evening, after a work event, he met Ember. She was different from Eliza in almost every way. While Eliza had always been the center of attention, Ember was quieter, content with her own thoughts and curiosities. They met through a mutual friend, and their conversation was unhurried, a slow exchange of stories and laughter over the hum of a crowded cafe. "So, what got you into photography?" she asked, leaning forward, her eyes warm and genuinely interested. Henry shrugged, smiling softly. "It's therapeutic, I guess. It makes me slow down, look at things differently. I started just to keep myself busy, but now it's become more than that." Ember nodded. "I get that. It's funny, isn't it? The things we discover when we're not really looking." Their conversation drifted to other topics, and as the evening wore on, Henry felt something unexpected, a lightness. For the first time, he wasn't looking back, he wasn't comparing, he wasn't haunted by what he'd lost. With Ember, he was simply himself, a man who'd been through his own share of heartbreak and come out the other side. Over the next few months, Henry and Ember grew closer. She had a calming presence, her own resilience forged from her own experiences. She never pried about his past, but over time, he shared bits and pieces, allowing himself to open up to her, to feel vulnerable without fear. One evening, as they walked by the lake near his place, she gently took his hand. They sat on a bench, watching the sun dip below the water's edge, casting shades of orange and purple across the sky. "I know it's not easy to trust again," she said quietly, her hand resting on his. "But I want you to know, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to rush, Henry." He looked at her, gratitude swelling in his chest. "Thank you, Ember. I didn't think I'd ever get to this place. I thought I'd be bitter forever. But you've shown me something different. You've taught me that maybe there's more to life than holding on to the past." She squeezed his hand, her expression soft. "We're all healing from something," she replied. "Sometimes it just takes the right person to remind us that it's okay to let go." Henry felt a peace he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he genuinely believed he could move forward, that he didn't need to carry the weight of betrayal anymore. He had found someone who understood him, who accepted his scars, and with her, he felt the stirrings of trust and hope. As Henry and Ember's relationship blossomed, he couldn't help but reflect on his past, but this time with a different perspective. His anger and pain were no longer the sharp, unforgiving forces they'd once been. Instead, they had softened like scars that no longer hurt to touch. He saw Eliza's betrayal for what it was, her choice, her mistake, and realized it no longer defined him. He had the power to shape his own life, to decide who he wanted to be moving forward. But just as he felt himself reaching a place of true closure, an unexpected piece of Eliza's story came to light. One afternoon, as he was cleaning out some old files, he came across an envelope he hadn't noticed before. It was from a mutual friend of his and Eliza's, someone he hadn't spoken to since everything fell apart. Inside was a note with a single line. You should know the whole truth before you move on completely. Curious, Henry took a moment to gather his thoughts, unsure if he wanted to revisit the past. But something compelled him to look further. In the envelope was a single letter, written in Eliza's handwriting, addressed to him. Henry, I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if you even care to know, but I need to say it, if only for my own peace. I was lost in ways I couldn't understand, and I ended up hurting the one person who mattered most to me. The affair, it wasn't just a mistake. It was my way of running from everything I was too afraid to face in myself. I see that now. I don't know if it matters to you, but I want you to know that what we had was real. I loved you, and in my own twisted way, I thought I'd find something more by stepping outside of what we built. I know it sounds like an excuse, and maybe it is. I know you don't owe me anything, least of all forgiveness. But please know, you were the best part of my life. I just couldn't see it until it was too late. Henry sat in silence, the letter resting in his hands. He felt a strange mixture of emotions, sadness, closure, and, surprisingly, a hint of sympathy. Eliza's words echoed in his mind, giving him insight into her mistakes, her regrets, her flawed attempts to find herself at his expense. And though it didn't excuse her actions, it did offer him something he hadn't expected, a final piece of closure. He folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, taking a deep breath. It was over. The anger, the bitterness, the resentment, it had finally lifted. Eliza's mistakes were her own, and they no longer had any hold on him. He had grown past the pain, and he had something beautiful in his life now with Ember. Later that evening, Henry shared the experience with Ember, who listened quietly, her hand resting on his. "So, how do you feel?" she asked gently. "I think," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I finally feel free. I can remember the good times without letting the bad overshadow them. And I don't feel the need to hold on to any resentment anymore. Eliza made her choices, and I'm making mine." Ember smiled softly, a hint of pride in her eyes. "You've come so far, Henry, and I'm glad I could be part of that journey with you." He reached out, taking her hand. "You've been more than part of it, Ember. You've helped me rebuild my life. I don't know where I'd be without you." They shared a quiet moment, a sense of peace settling between them. For the first time, Henry truly felt he was standing on solid ground, his past no longer a shadow but a lesson he had learned and left behind. In the weeks that followed, Henry continued to embrace this new chapter with Ember by his side. Their bond deepened, built on trust, understanding, and shared experiences. He allowed himself to love again, fully and without reservation, feeling stronger and more alive than he ever had before. Eliza's betrayal, once a wound that consumed him, had become a mere chapter in his story, one that had led him here, to a place of newfound happiness and purpose. With Ember, he saw a future he could believe in, a life where trust and love could grow, unburdened by the past. And as he looked at her, laughing by his side, he knew he'd made it through the storm. He was free, ready to move forward, and, finally, at peace. Henry looked out of his living room window as he waited for Ember to arrive. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and he felt at peace, more than he had in years. The turmoil of the past seemed like a distant memory, softened by time and his newfound happiness. Yet, a small part of him wondered why Eliza had called him out of the blue earlier, saying she wanted to talk one last time. Just then, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, he was greeted by the sight of Eliza standing there, looking fragile and unsure, clutching her purse tightly. She looked up at him, a mixture of desperation and hope in her eyes. "Henry, thank you for seeing me," she said, her voice soft and wavering. He nodded, stepping aside. "Come in. Let's get this over with." They walked into the living room, and he motioned for her to sit. Eliza hesitated, her gaze lingering on the framed photographs on the mantel. One was of him and Ember, their smiles genuine and filled with a warmth she hadn't seen in him for years. She swallowed hard, clearly struggling with what she wanted to say. I don't know where to begin," she started, her hands twisting in her lap. I've made so many mistakes, Henry, and I know I can't take them back. I hurt you in ways I never imagined I could, and I've paid for it every day since. Henry leaned back, crossing his arms. He watched her, calm and detached. So, why are you here, Eliza? What do you want from me now? Eliza flinched at his tone, but she took a deep breath and continued. I miss what we had, Henry. I missed us. You were the best thing in my life, and I was too blind to see it. I don't expect forgiveness, but I thought maybe if there's any chance we could start over. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. He shook his head, a faint, almost sad smile tugging at his lips. You know, Eliza, for a long time, I thought maybe I'd never move past what you did. I thought your betrayal would haunt me forever. But I have moved on, and I've finally found peace. But Henry, we had a life together, she interrupted, her voice breaking. I know I ruined it, but doesn't any of it matter to you? The years we spent, the memories. Henry looked her straight in the eyes, unwavering. Yes, we had memories, and for a while, I let those memories hold me back, thinking they were worth more than what you did to us. But that's not love, Eliza. Love isn't betrayal. Love isn't lying and sneaking around with someone else, then begging for another chance when things don't work out. You want forgiveness? You have it. But us? We're over. She wiped away a tear, her shoulders slumping. So, you've really moved on? There's no chance? He nodded firmly. I have, Eliza. I've found someone who values me, who understands what it means to be loyal, and who actually respects the life we're building together. Eliza's face crumpled as she finally accepted his words. She opened her mouth, searching for something, anything, that might make a difference, but the silence between them grew. She looked down, defeated, realizing the depth of what she had lost. After a long moment, she stood up, clutching her purse tightly to her chest. I understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I hope you're happy, Henry. Truly. He gave a single nod. Thank you. I hope you find peace, Eliza. We both know you'll need it. She bit her lip, holding back another wave of tears, and turned to leave. Henry watched her go, feeling a sense of finality settle over him. For the first time, he felt no resentment, no anger, only relief that this chapter was closed. He knew now, without a doubt, that he had made the right choice to leave the past behind. Later that evening, Henry met Amber at their favorite restaurant. As they shared a quiet meal, she could sense something was different. You seem lighter tonight, she observed, reaching across the table to take his hand. He chuckled, nodding. I guess I am. I finally had a chance to put everything to rest. Eliza came by today, wanted to talk, but it's done. I have everything I need right here, with you. She squeezed his hand, a gentle smile spreading across her face. I'm glad, Henry. You deserve peace and happiness, and I'm grateful to be part of it. They continued their meal, sharing stories and laughter, completely immersed in each other's company. For Henry, the evening felt like a new beginning, a life untouched by betrayal and regret, a future full of possibility and trust. As the months passed, Henry continued to thrive. His relationship with Amber grew stronger, grounded in mutual respect and understanding. He felt like a different person, unburdened by the mistakes of the past, ready to embrace a future full of love and hope. Meanwhile, Eliza and her lover struggled with the consequences of their actions. Their relationship, once thrilling in secrecy, began to crumble under the weight of guilt and regret. The affair had destroyed both of their reputations, and their families had turned their backs on them. In the small community where they lived, whispers followed them wherever they went, and they became social outcasts. Every now and then, Henry would hear bits and pieces of Eliza's life. He learned that she was facing financial hardship, struggling to rebuild a life that had been tarnished by her own choices. While he no longer wished ill upon her, he couldn't help but feel that her situation was a result of the path she had chosen. One day, as he and Amber strolled through a local park, Henry happened to catch a glimpse of Eliza sitting alone on a bench, her head bowed, looking worn and defeated. She didn't see him, but the sight served as a reminder of the life he had escaped, a life weighed down by dishonesty and broken trust. He turned to Ember, who was happily chatting about their weekend plans, and felt a surge of gratitude. He had found something real, something true. The pain of the past had faded, replaced by a deep appreciation for the love and trust he now shared with Ember. "Let's go," he said, pulling Ember gently toward the path that led away from Eliza and everything she represented. She smiled up at him, and together they walked forward, leaving the past firmly behind them. And as they moved on, hand in hand, Henry knew he had finally closed the book on that chapter of his life. He was free, and for the first time, he truly felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.